Hello, my name is Emma, and in today's video, I'm going to explain the difference between remind and remember. I'm also going to talk about the grammar of remind and the grammar of remember and the rules that go along with these two words. So let's start with remind. I'm going to first start by showing you two sentences. I have the nurse reminded me to take my medication. My second sentence is, Facebook reminded me to wish my friend happy birthday. So, can you guess, what does it mean to remind someone to do something? Well, when we remind someone, it means someone or something makes you think of something. Okay, so when you're using the word remind, we have someone or something. In this case, the nurse is someone. Facebook is something. We have the verb remind. We have a person, me. So it reminds me to think about this. So the nurse makes me think, take your medicine. Facebook makes me think, wish my friend a happy birthday. Okay, so you need an object or a person to make you think of something. I know that sounds confusing, but when I show you more examples, it's going to become very clear and easy. So, one thing I wanted to say about the word remind is always followed by a person. The person doesn't have to be me. It can be me, you, him, her, them, us, Jane, my mom, my dad. It can be any person. So you'll notice here's remind. It's followed by me. I could change this to remind you, remind her, remind them. Okay? As long as there's a person after the word, then you're doing it correctly. Okay, so now we're going to look at some other examples of remind to really help you understand this word. Okay, so I'm going to give you 4 examples of remind, and then we'll talk about the grammar of each of these sentences. So my first example is, my calendar reminds me of my appointments. So in my agenda, I have a calendar, and I write down my doctor appointments, my dentist, any meetings I have, everything I have to do in a week, I write in my agenda. So when I see this agenda, or when I see my calendar, it makes me think of what I need to do. It reminds me of what I need to do. So in this case, my calendar reminds me of my appointments. It makes me think of my appointments. I am a very forgetful person, so I need to be reminded of things a lot. I use this little notepad to write down anything I need to be reminded of. So for example, this notepad reminds me to wear sunscreen. I always forget to wear sunscreen, and when I get a sunburn, I look like a tomato. So I write down wear sunscreen, and I tape this to my door, so that way, whenever I'm about to go outside, I think, oh, I need sunscreen. So this pad of paper reminds me to wear sunscreen. It also reminds me, I have a lot written down here, to buy milk today. My next sentence is about my brother. The dentist reminded my brother that he needs to floss more. So for a lot of people, when they go to the dentist often says, you need to floss. The dentist reminds people to floss. Okay? So this is a great example. And again, we always have a person after the word remind, and it's either a thing or a person that makes us think of something. So in this case, the dentist is making my brother think he needs to floss. Now there's another way we use remind in English, and that's where it's similar to resemble or look like, smell like, to have something similar to something else. So I'm going to give you an example of this. I remind my aunt of my grandma. I have here a photo of my grandma. You probably can't see it, but her and I actually look like twins. When my grandma was younger, she looked very much like me. So when my aunt sees me, she thinks, wow, they look a lot alike. So I remind my aunt of my grandma. When my aunt sees me, she thinks of my grandma. I'm going to give you another example of this, which is true, and I think it's quite funny. Somebody has said to me, "You remind me of Nicole Kidman." I don't think I look like Nicole Kidman, but I loved the compliment, so thank you for that. Another thing somebody said to me was, "You remind me of Barbie." I also take that as a compliment. So it means I'm similar to Nicole Kidman and Barbie. I don't know if you agree, but that's what I've heard before. So now let's look at the grammar of remind. Okay, so we have the thing or the object, the verb remind, the person, in this case me. The next word we can use, there's different words we can use. One word we can use is of. If we use of, the next word needs to be a noun. So, for example, my calendar reminds me of my appointments. Facebook reminds me of my friend's birthday. So, of is always followed by a noun in this case. Well, I shouldn't say always. There's always exceptions, but it's usually followed with a noun. Another thing you might notice in the next sentence is we have the word here, to. We often use remind and to together. So we have this notepad reminds me. Again, remind is always followed by a person. To wear sunscreen. When we're talking about a task or some kind of job we have to do, we often use to and then a verb. My mother reminds me to call her. My grandmother reminds me to send her a postcard. These are examples of using remind with to. So we can use it with of, we can use it with to, and we can also use it with the word that. The dentist reminded my brother that he needs to floss more. When we use that, the next thing that follows is a subject. So that can be he, she, I, you, they, and a verb. So the dentist reminded my brother that he needs to floss more. I reminded my brother that he owes me money. Okay, so another example of using that. And finally, when we talk about resemble, we usually use of. So if you want to say someone looks like someone else or reminds you in another way of someone else, it can be their personality is similar, the way they talk is similar, the way they think is similar. Any way they are similar, you can use remind the person of and then the second person. Now let's look at how we use remember in a sentence and how it is different than remind. All right, so now let's talk about remember. Remember means to think about a memory from the past or something from the past. The difference between remember and remind is with remind, you need a person or a thing to make you think about something else. With remember, you don't need anything. I can just remember just by thinking. Okay, so here are some examples. Do you remember what you wore yesterday? So what clothes did you wear yesterday? Do you remember? So if I think, I can remember. I remember wearing a flower dress, a different flower dress. I remember yesterday I wore a choker or a nice necklace. And I remember yesterday I wore sandals. Can you remember what you wore yesterday? So again, notice I didn't need an object and I didn't need a person. I could think of it myself. Let's look at another example of remember. I remember when I went to Spain. So I went to Spain when I was 15 or 16 years old. It was my first trip outside of Canada. So I remember when I went to Spain. I have a memory about Spain. I have many memories from Spain. So I use remember. I remember my first boyfriend. Tim was his name. So I can think about memories of Tim from my past. I don't need to see Tim to do this. I just can think of it. I remember visiting my grandma when I was a child. A couple of weeks ago, I saw my kindergarten teacher, and I was very happy because my kindergarten teacher said, "I remember you." Well, hopefully that's a good thing because your kindergarten teacher either remembers you because you were a great student or you were terrible. I don't know which one, but my kindergarten teacher said, "I remember you." So these are some examples of remember. Now let's talk about the grammar of remember. It's very different from the grammar of remind. With remind, we always have a person after the word remind. With remember, we don't. We use other things after remember. So let's look at the first sentence I wrote. Do you remember what you wore yesterday? We often use words like what, when, why, who after remember. Do you remember who your first crush was? Do you remember why you chose to study English? Okay, so we often use what, when, why, how with the word remember. Here's another example of that. I remember when I went to Spain. And notice after these words like what and when, we have a subject and a verb. Okay, another thing we can do after remember is we can just have a noun. A noun is a person, a place, a thing, or an idea. So here I have, I remember my first boyfriend, Tim. Tim's a noun, okay? So I could say, I remember Tim. It's a very simple sentence, but again, it's a noun. We don't need anything else. Or here's another example of that. I remember you. I'm a noun. I'm a person. I remember the chair. I remember the cup. So you can use remember with a noun. Okay, now I have another example. I remember visiting my grandma. So here we have a verb after remember. And notice what the verb looks like. It has ing at the end. So sometimes when we use the verb remember, the verb after has ing. And we use ing when we're talking about an action in the past. So I remember visiting my grandma. I remember watching Star Wars. I remember going to my friend's house yesterday. Okay, so notice I used ing with each of those verbs. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about one last grammar point with the word remember. So when we're talking about things in the past, we can also use the word that after remember. So here's an example. I remember that I had a nice teacher. I remember she was very sweet. I remember that I loved school as a kid. I loved English as a kid. So notice that after the word that, I have a subject and a verb. So I remember that I had a nice teacher. I remember that I loved English, I still love English, but I loved English as a kid. So anytime after that, you need a subject and a verb. So let's talk about the last point about remember. We can also use remember to and a verb. When we use remember to and a verb, we're talking about a task or a job. In this case, it means don't forget to do a task or a job. So, for example, remember to buy milk. And so after to, we have the verb to buy. Remember to call me. I always forget to call people, so my mom always tells me, remember to call me. I tell this to my students a lot. Remember to do your homework. Many students forget, so I have to say, don't forget. Remember to do your homework. And here's the last thing I'll say. Remember to check out www.engvid.com. On this website, there's a quiz about everything I have just talked about in this video. So you can practice the difference between remind and remember and all the grammar points I covered. There are a lot of other resources on engvid.com, so I highly recommend you check it out. You can also subscribe to my channel. There you will find many other videos on different topics related to English, like pronunciation, grammar, writing, and many more. You can also check out my website at www.teacheremma.com. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care.